Do we have archaeological evidence of the resurrection of Jesus? Let's talk about it. Hi, my name is Jordan McClinton. I'm an archaeologist studying the material culture from the land of the Bible. Now look, I know when people hear that there's evidence of the resurrection, we get a little hesitant, but hear me out. In 1878, a marble slab written in Koine Greek called the Nazareth inscription was found, and it looks very similar to this replica that we have hanging on the wall. This object has been dated between the reign of Claudius or possibly Vespasian between 37 and 41 AD. And as its name alludes, it was found in the city of Nazareth. Now, interestingly, the inscription on this slab is an edict directly from Rome that states that if someone were to steal a body within Israel, that you will receive the death penalty. It is essentially capital punishment for grave robbers. And based on the location as well as the time period that this is dated to, some are connecting this to the story that's being told from the aftermath of the resurrection of Jesus. We know in the biblical text that the Pharisees and the Jewish leaders were spreading a rumor that the disciples had stolen the body of Jesus, and that's why the empty tomb. And it's not unreasonable to think that this story has spread so much that it has finally reached Rome. And that in turn, the Roman emperor would release an edict that states that if you steal a body from a tomb, you will be put to death. And although this is not direct evidence of the resurrection, the verisimilitude of the evidence and the story that we read in the Bible is very obvious. And historically, something we would expect to see in the aftermath of such a large event.
Now, this is a very compelling element, very compelling evidence, I should say, that there is the possibility that this stone, this inscription was given out by Rome during a time frame where the story of Jesus rising from the grave and this cult growing in its popularity is valid, and that there was a Jesus character, a historical Jesus character who rose from the grave and that many people were believing it. Furthermore, you can dismiss with the idea that this was actually talking about Nicaeus, who in the earlier BCE area, he was known as a Greek tyrant, and that the marble from this stone actually came from the Isle of Kos. And the fact that the people of the Isle of Kos had many different communications with the people in Israel, especially in Galilee, which is where Nazareth is found, it would seem that having a piece of marble that came from Kos to Nazareth and then have an inscription written on it is a very likely thing. But the fact that people would say that it is written about the fact that the tyrant Nicaeus, whose grave was robbed and whose grave was, his body was paraded around the town and brutalized, that this is the reason why the edict was actually written, which would place it in the BCE time frame. But there are problems with that theory. And many of the problems with that theory is the fact that within the inscription that is on it, it uses a Greek word that means that the sepulcher was sealed. And what we do know is that throughout the Roman Empire, it was only the Jewish people who actually used a sealing sepulcher stone. That sealing sepulcher stone would be placed there until the body in the first century would rot away. Once the body has been rotten away, then the bones will be collected and placed in an ossuary. That was the normal traditional burial system in Israel at that time frame. This wasn't something that was practiced by Greeks. So it is very unlikely that since it talked about a sepulcher sealing, that it was talking about the tyrant Nicaeus from the Isle of Kos, even though this island had many dealings with. Now, some of those dealings with Israel is the fact that we can find that there are inscriptions concerning Herod the Great that was written by the people of Kos, inscriptions found in Kos, I should say, concerning Herod the Great. So therefore, it would seem that this Nazareth stone is not talking about Nicaeus. It's talking about what's going on in Israel, about people robbing graves in Israel. And since there are many verses in Acts that speak of the Pharisees going around and people telling the story that the disciples themselves or the apostles were the ones who stole the stone, it would it lends to the idea that this story was well known, and so therefore it is documented and is in reference to the Jesus of Nazareth story. Because as many other apologists would say, the most famous person to ever come out of Nazareth was Jesus and the Jesus story. But is that the full answer? Is that the full thought process? So just wait a minute, because it's not. So what do we know about the culture during that time frame? We know that Galilee, which was being ruled as a client kingdom under the Roman authority. And being a client kingdom under the Roman authority, it was ruled by the Herodian dynasty. Most of you know about Herod the Great, and then you know about Herod Archelaus, who was ruling over Judea in 6 CE when he was finally disposed of, and then he became then they instituted governorship over Judea. But during that time frame that there was governorship over Judea, Herod Antipas was still reigning as a client kingdom for the Romans during the time frame that this inscription would have been written, and it would have been particularly talking about the people in Galilee, since it was found in Nazareth, which is where it gets its name, the Nazareth stone. As we can see that it was being ruled by Herod Antipas up until 39 CE. And then it came under direct rulership of Rome in after 39 CE. And then afterwards, we have the Jewish revolt that happens between 66 to 73 CE. And during that Jewish revolt of Galilee, this is when Vespasian comes into power. So it is unlikely that the inscription was written by Vespasian, but most likely written or authorized by Claudius. Now, why would Claudius push that, or Claudius or Caligula put that inscription out there? Because they would have reigned during those time frames. Well, let's take into account the Jesus narrative. In the Jesus narrative, you have Pontius Pilate, who is the primary Roman villain of the story. As that Roman villain, he was known to be a cruel governor of Judea, which that governorship would have had to have started after 6 CE to be the governor during the time frame of the Jesus character. But through Roman records and the writings of Josephus and other writers, we know that Pilate was also called into a trial by Tiberius. And he was called to be put on trial by Tiberius because of his cruel handling of the Sumerian revolt that occurred during his governorship. But he was also being called for his brutal handling of the people in Judea. Now, mind you, this inscription is in Galilee, a client kingdom. He's being called for the cruelty he's doing in Judea. Why is that important? It's important because during the time frame of first century Judea, there were many Galileans who claimed to be the Messiah. Whether it's Judas the Galilean in 6 CE, whether it's Simon Bar Glor, whether it is Simon of Panera, whether it is any of these people who are listed here, each one of them are Galileans, Nazareth, who could have come from Nazareth, but they were Galileans living under a client kingdom, not under Pilate's rulership, but they came into Jerusalem claiming to be the Messiah, and then they were all crucified. And through the cruelty of Pontius Pilate, he was being called on trial by Tiberius. Tiberius dies. He is still disposed of by Caligula, and he either was assassinated or he killed himself during that time frame. So it is very reasonable that the reason why this inscription was done, whether by Caligula or Claudius, it was done because the Jewish people were in constant reverence or looking for a Messiah that would come and overthrow the Roman government. And many of these messiahs were executed, at least a dozen, by crucifixion, and then buried with a sepulchre stone. And therefore, many people have the same story as the Jesus character. This doesn't point to Jesus. This just points to what they thought the Messiah would be. So always remember, you have to free yourself to be yourself because your greatness is non-negotiable.